Good evening, community. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything like that. I'm just a regular man, a family man, a hard worker, and although I've lived in this same town my entire life, I never paid much attention to the stories the old folks tell. But I'm going to be honest with you. After what happened to me that night, I'm not so sure everything is just made-up stories anymore. It was just an ordinary night and I was alone in the house. My wife had taken the kids to visit some relatives in the next town over, and I stayed behind because I had work the next day. Nothing unusual. I went to bed early like I always do, and I was sleeping like a rock. Then suddenly, in the middle of the night, I was woken up by a strange sound. At first I thought it might be a truck or something like that, but after a couple of seconds, I realized it wasn't that. The sound was more old, if that makes sense. It sounded like the creaking of wooden wheels and the clopping of horse hooves on the street. And yes, I know it sounds odd because no one uses carriages in this town anymore, especially not at that hour. I stayed in bed trying to listen more closely. The sound continued, getting closer and closer, and I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. I've heard the town's stories my whole life, and though I didn't believe in them at that moment, I remembered what they say about the death cart. According to the old folks, when you hear it passing by your street, it's because it's coming for someone. Of course, the rational part of me tried to take control. It's nonsense, I told myself, but the sound kept coming closer and closer. The worst part was when it stopped right in front of my house. I swear my blood ran cold at that moment. The street was completely empty, but I could feel a presence, as if something heavy was right outside. I slowly got out of bed without making a sound and walked toward the window. That's when I remembered what the old folks said. Never look at the cart because if you do, you're dooming yourself or someone close to you. So even though the window was only a few steps away, I stayed still. I couldn't bring myself to peek out, though curiosity was eating me alive. I knew something was out there, something I shouldn't see. The tension in the house was unbearable, like the air had turned thick, almost as if I couldn't breathe properly. Then, I heard it. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like someone was whispering my name from the street and my heart started racing. It's your imagination, I kept telling myself, but the whisper wouldn't stop. There was no wind, no other sound, just that voice that somehow knew it was calling me. I tried to control myself. I told myself it couldn't be real, that there had to be a logical explanation. But just when I was about to open the window, I heard another sound. It was like something heavy and solid hit the ground outside, a dull thud. I didn't dare move. Fear had me frozen in place because the cart was still there, or at least it seemed to be. I don't know how long I stood there, too scared to look. I just remember that all of a sudden, the sound of the wooden wheels started again, slowly moving away until the street was completely silent once more. I don't know if you've ever been so scared that you feel like your heart is going to explode, but that's exactly how I felt at that moment. I stayed awake until dawn. I couldn't close my eyes, not after that. When the sun finally came up, I felt such a huge sense of relief that I almost laughed at how stupid I'd acted. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe I'd heard some animal or something like that. But the strangest part of all is that morning, while I was having my coffee, I found out that my neighbor, Don Felipe, had died during the night. He was an older man, had been sick for a while, but what really disturbed me was the fact that the cart had stopped right in front of my house, which is next to his. I never told anyone what happened that night because I was too embarrassed to admit I had been scared of a simple legend. But the truth is, ever since then, I haven't been able to shake the feeling. Every time night falls, I think about what I heard, that whisper calling my name, and the thud that felt like something, or someone, had been taken away. And look, maybe it was all just a coincidence. Maybe the cart had nothing to do with Don Felipe's death. But since that day, I can't stop thinking that death really does walk the streets, looking for those whose time has come. Sometimes, on very quiet nights when everything is still, I lie awake in bed, hoping I won't hear those wooden wheels or those horse hooves clattering down the cobblestone streets of the town again. I haven't seen or heard anything since that night, But the feeling that something was there, so close, hasn't left me. And I'll tell you something. Now every time someone tells me they've heard those sounds in the middle of the night, I prefer not to doubt them. I don't want to know if the next time the cart passes, it'll be for me. Now that I've told you my story, I wonder if I'm the only one who's experienced something like this. I know these things sound like pure superstition, and believe me, I used to think the same, until this happened to me. I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if there really is something beyond what we can see or understand. I've wondered if perhaps any of you at some point in your life have heard that same sound in the night, the creaking of wooden wheels and the clopping of horse hooves on the cobblestones. Has anyone else felt that strange presence like death itself was wandering nearby? Or maybe you've heard a similar story from a family member or a neighbor. Maybe it's all just a coincidence, or maybe there's something more, something that's always been there, but we don't want to see. I'm not sure if it would comfort me to know I'm not the only one, or if that would just make all of this even more unsettling. After all, these experiences, no matter how much we try to ignore them, stay with us in some way. My name is Raul, and I have a ranch in San Esteban, a small town in Jalisco. Life here is peaceful, monotonous for some, but I've always enjoyed that feeling of nothing changing. The houses are made of adobe, and at night, the silence is almost absolute, so much so that sometimes it's hard to sleep because everything is so quiet. My house, like many others, is on the outskirts of town, surrounded by open fields and mountains in the distance. It's a good place for someone like me, who's over 40 and just looking for peace. Several years ago, I divorced my wife, and since then, I've been alone, taking care of the livestock and the land. A few months ago, strange things started happening. Neighbors began talking about missing animals, cows and horses that simply vanished without a trace. At first, I thought it might be coyotes or even a thief, but the stories got weirder by the day. Some people claimed they saw shadows at nightfall. Others heard strange noises in the corrals. I didn't pay much attention until it happened to me. That night, like so many others, I was in the kitchen preparing something for dinner. It was very late for my usual bedtime, around 10, and it had been a long day. I was chopping some vegetables when I heard Coyote, my dog, barking nonstop in the backyard. Coyote is a calm dog. He doesn't usually bark unless something unusual is going on. I went out with the flashlight in hand, expecting to see some wild animal wandering around, but when I shined the light on the corral, there was nothing, just the wind moving the branches of the trees. Yet Coyote was still restless, growling into the darkness beyond the fence. It must be a coyote or a fox, I thought, and went back inside. But that strange feeling wouldn't leave me. That night, I barely slept, listening to the sounds of the countryside, waiting to hear something more. The night passed, and early in the morning I went to see Don Luis, an old friend and neighbor. I told him what had happened, expecting him to laugh or tell me it was just something that comes with age. But his reaction surprised me. He looked at me seriously, and in a low voice he said, "Raul, be careful. It's not an animal wandering around. Whatever it is out there, it's no good." "What do you mean it's no good?" I asked, feeling a little uncomfortable. "My grandfather used to tell me stories, things no one wants to remember anymore. But you keep a close watch on Coyote, and don't go out alone at night." I laughed, trying to brush off his words, but that feeling that something wasn't right stayed with me. I went back home, thinking about what Don Luis had said, though I tried to carry on with my normal routine. A couple of days passed without anything strange happening, until one early morning, I woke up abruptly. It was one of those nights when the silence is so heavy it makes you uneasy. The house was completely dark, and the only thing breaking the silence was the wind rustling the tree branches. I got up, disoriented, and that's when I heard it. A soft noise, like footsteps dragging around the outside of the house. I went to the window and looked out into the yard. There was nothing. Yet the sound persisted, as if someone was walking around the house, at a slow, almost deliberate pace. I turned on the flashlight and stepped into the yard, my heart racing. At first I saw nothing, but when I turned the flashlight toward the shed, I saw a figure. It was tall and thin, and it seemed to be standing next to the wooden door. My first impulse was to scream, but I froze, unable to move. The figure did nothing, just stood there, still, staring at the shed door. I slowly backed toward the house door, and as soon as I closed it behind me, the noise stopped. My breathing was quick, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I turned off the flashlight and stood in the darkness of the kitchen listening. A dull thud echoed from the shed as if someone was trying to open the door. Then, silence. I didn't go outside again until dawn. The next day I checked the shed. Everything was in its place, but there was something strange on the ground. Some long, odd footprints ended abruptly near the fence. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. The following week, the town was full of stories. Other neighbors claimed to have seen the same figure wandering around their houses at night. The descriptions were always the same: tall, thin, moving in an unnatural way. Some said it was a spirit. Others talked about an old legend of a creature that appears in remote towns, bringing bad luck with it. I tried not to pay attention to those stories, but the truth is, since that night, I haven't slept the same. The figure hasn't returned. At least I haven't seen it again. But every time I hear coyote growl, my body freezes and I don't leave my room for hours. I keep wondering what it was that I saw, and though Don Luis insists that we need to get to the bottom of this, something inside me would rather not know. Many of us have witnessed that figure, and I hope that someday we'll understand better what's happening in this town. My name is Diego, and I am an architect specializing in the restoration of old buildings. Some time ago, I was offered an interesting project to evaluate the structure of an estate, a building in a small town in the center of the country. The idea of working in a place with so much history attracted me, although I knew the town had its own stories about the estate. The locals warned me that the estate was haunted. They said that at night you could hear wailing and that no one dared to enter after sunset. I'm not someone who believes in those things, but I couldn't help but notice the way they said it, as if what they were telling me wasn't just simple superstition. The estate was in very bad shape when I arrived. From the first day, I noticed that there was something strange in the air. The house creaked more than normal, and in some areas, there was an inexplicable cold, even in broad daylight. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. Even though we were in the countryside, there were no birds, no sound of wind. It was as if the place was wrapped in a vacuum. I visited the estate for several weeks, but I always returned to the town to sleep. The locals had suggested I not stay there at night, and although I didn't believe in ghosts, the idea of being alone in that immense house didn't seem appealing to me. The strangest thing that happened in the early days was finding a couple of tools on the floor, even though I was sure I had left them on the table. But that wasn't unusual for such a neglected place. One afternoon, while I was reviewing some plans in the main hall, I heard a sound. It was brief, a soft whisper that came from some corner of the second floor. I ignored it at first, but a few minutes later, I heard it again, and this time it was clearer. It sounded like a moan, so I decided to go upstairs, but I found nothing. Silence filled the house again, but this time the air felt heavier. The next day, while taking a break in the town, I decided to ask Don Arturo, an elderly man who knew the history of the estate well. That's when he told me about Isabel, the daughter of the former owner. According to the legend, Isabel had fallen in love with one of the workers on the estate. Her father, furious when he found out, fired him, and Isabel was kept under watch to prevent her from seeing him again. They say she died of heartbreak waiting for her love. Since then, her spirit has wandered the estate. The story intrigued me, but being a skeptic, I didn't give it much weight. However, that same night, just as I was about to leave, a sudden storm hit the estate. The road back to town became impassable as the stream overflowed, and I had no choice but to spend the night in the house. I turned on the lights in the main hall, trying to stay calm. It was just a storm after all. Everything was silent. The only sound was the rain hitting the windows. Then, around midnight, I heard the moan again. This time, it was unmistakable. A soft, but drawn-out sound, like someone crying quietly. I stood still, listening. There was no wind, and there was no way the sound was coming from outside. I decided not to investigate. Something inside me told me it was better not to know where it was coming from. The storm kept battering the house, and every creak of the beams made the atmosphere more tense. I stayed in one of the chairs in the hall, trying to ignore the sound, but it was impossible. For hours, I heard what seemed like soft footsteps, as if someone was walking on the floor above. Sometimes the moan would grow louder, then fade again. Finally, around 3 in the morning, everything went quiet. I couldn't hear the moan or the footsteps, not even the rain. The air felt lighter, as if something had left. That morning, when the storm subsided, I left as quickly as I could. I didn't mention anything about what had happened to the project managers or to Don Arturo. I just wanted to finish the job and leave that place behind. In the end, I finished the evaluation of the estate and handed in the plans, but since then, I haven't returned to that town. I don't know if what I heard was real, or if my mind, influenced by the locals' stories, played tricks on me by making me believe what they had suggested. Something about that estate isn't right. The moan of Isabel, or whatever produced it, still remains a mystery to me. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. There wasn't much to talk about, life was simple and routine, except when the name of Doña Emilia came up. She was an old woman who lived alone in an old house at the edge of town, isolated from everything and everyone. She had never had a family, no children, no husband, and the few times she was seen outside her house were when she went to the market, wrapped in a shawl, barely exchanging words with anyone. There were rumors that Doña Emilia had certain gifts, though no one openly talked about magic. They said she had a way of helping those who sought her out, but only in delicate matters, like health or affairs of the heart. I was always skeptical. To me, those were just stories from people who had nothing better to think about. My younger sister, Anna, used to joke with me about it. If she were really a witch, she would have solved everyone's problems by now, don't you think? She'd say. But when things started going wrong in our family, it wasn't so easy to make jokes anymore. Anna began to get sick out of nowhere. At first, it was simple things, fatigue, loss of appetite, but then she got worse. My mother took her to the doctor several times, but no one could find anything wrong. The tests came back fine, the results were normal, yet Anna kept declining. Desperate, my mother insisted that we go see Doña Emilia, but I was firmly opposed. I didn't believe in that stuff, and I didn't want to get involved in superstitions. Anna didn't seem convinced either, but the situation was weighing heavily on her. One day, without telling me, Anna decided to go on her own. She came back the next day and told me that Doña Emilia had received her kindly. She gave her some herbs to make a tea and told her to drink it every night for a week. Even though I didn't like the idea, I decided not to argue. Most likely, nothing will happen, I thought. And sure enough, at first, everything stayed the same. But after a few days, Anna began to get better. Little by little, she regained her appetite, her energy, and she seemed more cheerful. However, what unsettled me wasn't her recovery. It was her behavior. Anna didn't want to talk about it anymore. When I asked her about her visit to Doña Emilia, she would change the subject or simply ignore me. Of course, my mother was thrilled. She said Doña Emilia had worked a miracle and that we should be grateful to her, but I didn't share that view. Something didn't add up. I felt like there was more to this, so I decided to go speak to the old woman myself. One afternoon, I gathered my courage and went to her house. The old wooden door creaked as it opened, and Doña Emilia greeted me as if she already knew I was coming. She invited me in without saying much and offered me a cup of tea, the same one she had given my sister. Of course, I didn't accept it. I only wanted answers. "What did you do to Ana?" I blurted out, cutting straight to the point. Doña Emilia looked at me calmly, unfazed. Her face, wrinkled by years, reflected serenity. "I didn't do anything she didn't want," she replied softly. "I only helped her find what she had lost." "What does that mean?" I insisted, frustrated by her evasiveness. "Your sister was unbalanced, disconnected from herself," she explained. "I only helped her find her center again." Nothing she said sounded supernatural. She didn't speak of curses or spells, but the way she said it made me deeply uncomfortable. There was something in her tone, something almost hypnotic, that made me doubt everything. I couldn't get more information out of her, so I left, not really knowing what to think. In the days that followed, I started noticing strange things. Not just in Ana, but in other people in the town. Those who had visited Doña Emilia seemed different, more reserved. They acted normal, but there was a kind of secrecy in their eyes, a shadow in their behavior that I couldn't explain. I began to feel like the whole town was sharing a secret that I wasn't a part of. One afternoon, while walking through the plaza, I ran into Don Joaquin, a neighbor who had suffered from chronic pain for years. He told me that after a visit to Doña Emilia, his pain had disappeared. I asked if he had noticed anything strange, but he only responded with a strange smile. "She helps, but everything comes with a price." That phrase stuck with me. What price? No one spoke directly about it, but something told me that, even though my sister had gotten better, the cost of Doña Emilia's help wasn't something tangible. I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. I only helped her find what she had lost. The atmosphere in town began to change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. It wasn't something physical. It was more like a sensation, as if something heavy was hanging in the air. The people who had once been open and cheerful now seemed more cautious, as if something was holding them back. Was it just my paranoia, or was something really happening? Over time, I decided to distance myself from it all. I never spoke about it with Ana again, and although she was physically fine, there was a distance between us that I couldn't explain. It was as if, in some way, her experience with Doña Emilia had left an invisible mark on her, a mark that couldn't be erased. In the end, I never really knew what to think. Was Doña Emilia a witch, a healer, or simply a woman with abilities we didn't understand? Maybe she was all of those things, or maybe none. All I know is that, even though everything seemed to return to normal, there was always a lingering sense of unease. The kind of unease you feel when you know something isn't quite right, but you can't do anything to change it. Maybe Doña Emilia will remain there in her house at the edge of town, waiting for someone else to knock on her door seeking help. And maybe, like many others, they'll end up grateful. But as for me, I'll never be completely at ease.